This is Faux-Authentic History.
Hello, welcome to the podcast. I'm Brian Young.
And I'm Holly Fry.
Hey, Holly, how's it going?
It's great. How are you?
I am splendid. How would you like to talk about the Force?
I would like it so much because it is one of my favorite things to research and talk about.
Likewise. So today we're going to talk about the Force and the various people in the galaxy who wielded or worshipped the Force. So in order to start that, the Force is a mysterious thing. There's many different ways to approach it through the known galaxy, and we're gonna dive into some of those sects that use it and the various aspects of it.
And to start, we really have to talk a little bit about getting a baseline understanding of the Force, and that in and of itself is a little bit tricky because the Force is, as our listeners know, a mystical energy, and we don't actually know all that much about it, which is why so many different religious sects have arisen with their own interpretations to understand it. And the first recorded instances of the Force date back more than 25,000 years in galactic history.
What we do know for sure is that it's an energy field created by all living things. According to one concise account, it surrounds us, penetrates us, and binds the galaxy together. We know that there are many aspects to the Force as well. There's a living force and a cosmic force. We know that there's a light side of it known as the Ashla, and a dark side known as the Bogan. We know that there is a will of the Force, but what that will is and who or what might be behind that is a complete mystery.
And we also know that the Force interacts with microscopic beings known as midichlorians. So midichlorians, as we just said, are microscopic, but they're life forms that reside in all living cells. And this has given any form of life the potential to tap into the Force, or at least be influenced by it. But historically, only those who had a sufficient concentration of them in their blood could really hear the Force and manipulate it at the level of a full-blown Force wielder. And this symbiosis between living cells, midichlorians, and the Force is still really not understood, and it actually opens a lot of debate and a much larger mystery.
We do have some clues, though. Serenity, a Force priestess from the Wellspring of Life, was quoted as saying that all that surrounds her home is the, quote, foundation of life, the birthplace of what your science calls midichlorians, the foundation of what connects the living force and the cosmic force, and that when a living thing dies, all is renewed. Life passes away from the living force into the cosmic force and becomes one with it. One powers the other, one is renewed by the other.
So now that we have discussed at least sort of a bit of grounding information in what the Force is, as much as you can with such a mysterious thing, we're going to move on to some of those that wield or worship the Force across the galaxy.
We'll start with the Jedi. The Jedi Order served for over 1,000 generations in service to the Galactic Republic and tapped into the Ashla, or light side of the Force. Jedi were an order of warrior monks who adhered to a strict code and devoted their lives to peace and justice in the galaxy. They were based on Coruscant, the center of the galaxy, and maintained a massive temple there on the planet City.
Though they were centered on Coruscant, the Jedi had temples on planets all over the galaxy. The first was Achto. Others were located on planets ranging from Deveron and Lethal to Tython, Ossus, and Vrogas Voss.
The Jedi adhered to a strict code that forbade attachments and romantic relationships, instead focusing their lives on their mission and compassion for others, which was seen as central to the life of a Jedi. Jedi would test younglings at a young age just after birth in their ability in the Force or by their midichlorian count, and if they were identified as good candidates, the infants would be brought to the temple or other nursing facilities to begin their training, and that would cut off those attachments to family. So, for the most part, Jedi just didn't know who their birth family was or what their home planet was. They were all brought elsewhere.
And younglings were trained in groups until they would be chosen by a Jedi Knight or Master to obtain the rank of Padawan. So a Jedi Master or a Knight would take that Padawan and train them in a one-on-one situation. They would travel the galaxy with them and offer personalized instructions in the way of the Force and the life of the Jedi.
Padawans could achieve the rank of Knight in their teen years, but it was rare that any Knight received masterhood any earlier than their 30s. Once a master, Jedi were eligible to serve on the Jedi Council, and the Jedi Council was the ruling body of the Jedi Order and met in one of the high spires of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, a round room that seated each member. It was the job of the Council to guide the Jedi through galactic events, to make assignments and ponder the will of the Force, and read prophecies and things like that.
And they maintained a dogmatic view of the Force, and they held strictly to their spoken code that they taught to younglings at even the earliest ages. So here is what that code entailed. There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no passion, there is serenity. There is no chaos, there is harmony. There is no death, there is the Force.
Jedi were made up of just about every sentient species imaginable. As midichlorians were present in all life forms, the Jedi did not discriminate. Jedi were made up of just about every sentient species imaginable. As midichlorians were present in all life forms, the Jedi didn't discriminate, and discriminating candidates based on xenophobia was antithetical to the Jedi Code anyway.
They carried lightsabers as weapons, and the living kyber crystals in them were chosen in rituals in various places, but mainly upon the sacred world of Ilum. So younglings would travel there in small groups, and for each of them a crystal would choose them. Then, at least over the last 800 or 900 years of the existence of the Jedi, these younglings with their new crystals would board a ship called the Crucible, and a droid named Huyang would guide the younglings into making their lightsabers with those new crystals.
Once the younglings had their own lightsabers, they would be ready to be chosen by a master and begin their life's quest. This, of course, worked for a very long time and held the galaxy safe until the Clone Wars. At the conclusion of this war, though, the Jedi were wiped out by the Sith.
And now that, of course, brings us to the Sith. The Sith were an evil sect of Force wielders that tapped into the Bogan, or the dark side of the Force. Whereas the Jedi were able to access their power of the Force through peace and meditation and calm wisdom and compassion for others, the Sith relied on their passion and selfishness. Extreme emotions, particularly hate and anger, offered them their pathway to ability in the Force.
Like the Jedi, they too had a code, and here it is. Peace is a lie. There is only passion. Through passion I gain strength. Through strength I gain power. Through power I gain victory. Through victory my chains are broken. The Force shall free me.
There are many similarities between the Jedi and the Sith, mainly because they broke off from the Jedi about 6,000 years prior to the Clone Wars.
Thousands of years before the Clone Wars, through meditation and study, one rogue Jedi came to the conclusion that true power over the Force could be found through rejecting the passive nature of the Jedi and embracing aspects of the dark side. He wanted to find that balance between what the Jedi did and what the dark side was, and this sort of led to the Sith. The Jedi Council was skeptical about that idea, to say the least, and they ejected him from the Jedi Order because they choose who's a Jedi and decided that if he was going to dabble in the dark side, he could no longer be one.
So he went off and formed the sect known as the Sith and gathered followers. This period was known as the 100-Year Darkness, and eventually the Jedi managed to drive this small band of Sith from the known galaxy, and they found themselves on a sandy red world named Moribond, and they licked their wounds, working to strike at the Jedi again.
Over the years, the Jedi and the Sith fought many battles. The Sith used kyber crystals to create massive super weapons, even including some in their temples. The Sith definitely had temples similar to the Jedi, but access to them was rooted in pain and grueling, life-risking tasks, rather than the peace of mind required to navigate a Jedi temple. And one such temple was located beneath the surface of a planet called Malachor, and it could have been converted into a super weapon. It might be interesting to note too that Sith couldn't get kyber crystals in the way that the Jedi could. So the only way they could actually build lightsabers would be to kill a Jedi, steal their lightsaber, and bleed the crystal, which is why you've got Sith who always have red lightsabers.
One notable battle between the Jedi and Sith during these years took place on the planet of Takodana. That was the site that notorious pirate Maz Kanata eventually built her castle. And then another significant fight between the Jedi and Sith was the Jedi-Sith War, which was fought about 1,000 years prior to the Clone Wars and the elimination of the Jedi.
The Sith managed in this conflict to sack Coruscant and drive the Jedi from their headquarters, but many battles were fought during this conflict, and the Jedi were believed to have won, having killed every remaining Sith. And they had no idea that one Sith remained, and this was Darth Bane. And Bane instituted what was called the Rule of Two. He reasoned that since selfishness was such a central tenet to the Sith, that the infighting among their own ranks was as responsible for their downfall as the Jedi or anything else.
So the Rule of Two stated that there could be no more than 2 Sith at a time, a master and an apprentice. And once the apprentice had learned everything he could from the master and had become more powerful, that apprentice would usually murder the master and take the mantle for themselves. Upon becoming a Sith, apprentices would normally take the moniker Darth, and then a unique name appended to it that was given them by their master. So Palpatine, for example, was known as Darth Sidious, and his master was a Mune named Darth Plagueis.
Sidious named 3 apprentices, Darth Maul, Darth Tyrannus, who was secretly Count Dooku, the leader of the Separatists during the Clone Wars, and Darth Vader, who had previously been Jedi Knight Anakin Skywalker, who converted to the Sith after being promised the ability to save his wife, Padme Amidala, from certain death.
For 1,000 years, ruling in pairs, the Sith passed down their knowledge until they were able to rid the galaxy of the Jedi entirely, almost, at the end of the Clone Wars. For more than 20 years, the Sith ruled the galaxy with an authoritarian fist, committing genocide in the name of peace. And it wasn't until Luke Skywalker, the son of Anakin Skywalker, who was then Darth Vader, interceded and reminded Darth Vader of his humanity that the Sith were able to be wiped from the galaxy once and for all.
So, this leads us to another situation. So during the Dark Times, after the Sith, led by Darth Sidious, had purged the galaxy of Jedi for the most part, stories spread that the Jedi were evil, that they were selfish and wished to take power for themselves. And Sidious had engineered the destruction of the Jedi so that it seemed as though they had led a failed coup and their revolution was put down lethally.
There were those who did not believe this story, and they formed what was known as the Church of the Force. And this was an underground faith forbidden in the years of the Empire. They believed in the Jedi and the ideals that they had espoused, and they spread stories to counteract the Sith propaganda.
One prominent member of the Church of the Force was Lor San Tekka, who traveled the galaxy preserving what pieces of Jedi history he could, and he spread the true story of their destruction. And the Church existed from the end of the Clone Wars all the way through beyond the conflict with the First Order many decades later. In fact, one artifact that Lor San Tekka had kept safe was the map that led Rey to Luke Skywalker on Ahch-To, the site of the first Jedi Temple.
And so that will bring us to one of the groups that used and worshipped the Force that I find most fascinating, which is the Nightsisters of Dathomir. This was a sect of Force users that developed a connection to the dark side, and as I said, they were called the Nightsisters. And we've talked a bit about them on a previous episode, particularly their most important shaman, Mother Talzin, so you can go look for that episode about her if you want additional context.
So the Nightsisters were not Force wielders in the traditional sense, and their contact with the Force developed through geography as much as anything else. Their use of the Force was an old and dark power that flowed from their planet of Dathomir.
They called this magic, and they spelled that Magick, and their use of this magic was often accompanied by puffs of green mist, and their powers were not traditional in the Jedi, Sith, or Ashla Bogan sense of the Force either. They could instill their power into an individual and make that one person capable in combat and the Force. They could also raise fallen Nightsisters from the dead and use them in combat. And at one point, Mother Talzin even constructed bionic legs for Darth Maul after his had been cut off by Jedi Knight Obi-Wan Kenobi.
The Nightsisters were a matriarchal society that followed their shaman mother and lived in a secluded fortress built of stone in the isolated swamplands of Dathomir. And they lived apart from the Night Brothers, whose only purpose was to serve the Nightsisters and breed where required.
For a young woman wishing to join the Nightsisters, tests had to be passed. First, they had to wield the dark side to subdue a massive creature known as the Sleeper. And that creature lived in the depths of a pool in the village, and they had to bring back a part of its body. And once harvested, those remains that they brought back would be converted into the Water of Life, which was a healing potion that was made by the Nightsisters. Any initiate who gave in to her fear instead of confronting it during the test would just die in the water.
So we're going to turn now to a sect of Force believers that belong to one race of the galaxy. The Lasats had mystics on their planet of Lasan who dedicated themselves to the Force, which they called the Ashla, which leads many to believe that it's the same benevolent aspect of the Force that the Jedi wield.
One such mystic was Chava the Wise. Is it Shava or Chava?
I think Chava.
Okay. Let me look. That's the only one that should be weird. Okay. One such mystic was Chava the Wise, one of the last mystics after the Sith Empire's purge of Lasan. And the mystics were staunch pacifists who opposed violence of all kinds, much like the Jedi, but the Lasat Honor Guard had a connection to the Ashla with their bow rifles, and using them or other staffs, they could actually interact with the Force.
The Lasat, like the Jedi, were also big on prophecy and tapped into the Ashla to divine these prophecies and to follow their paths. One instance of this occurred when Garazeb Aurelios, a former member of the Lasat Honor Guard, he was an honor guard before the genocide at the hands of the Empire, used his bow rifle and belief in the Ashla to guide a hyperspace jump through a maelstrom to lead the last of the refugees of his people to their new hidden homeworld.
That is one of those things that could only be explained through a connection to the Force. That's just not something that anybody would be able to even guess at doing.
So another religious order devoted to the Force that we're going to talk about are the Guardians of the Whills.
And the Guardians of the Whills were an order based in the holy city of Jeddah, and they were the ordained protectors of the ancient Kyber temple there. Adherents wore, at least in part, red robes to signify their order, and they believed in the more benevolent aspects of the Force.
While the Guardians didn't have a code like the Jedi or the Sith, they prayed to the Force. One popular prayer was the Sunset Prayer, which went like this: "In darkness cold, in light cold, the old sun brings no heat. But there is heat in breath and life. In life there is the Force. In the Force there is life, and the Force is eternal."
Guardians would also chant things, such as, "I am one with the Force, and the Force is with me," to clear their minds and touch the Force, even if they didn't have a midichlorian count high enough to really tap into the Force the way that the Jedi would.
After the Empire took over the galaxy under the rule of the Sith, the ancient Kyber temple was under siege, and the Guardians of the Whills were disbanded. The Sith, as they'd done over so many thousands of years, were stealing the Kyber there to create massive superweapons.
Many Guardians stayed around the temple, doing what good in Jeddah they could and resisting the Empire, trying to take back the stolen Kyber crystals, and that included Chirrut Imwe and Baze Malbus. Chirrut was a blind monk of the Order, and Baze had been a part of the Order but had become a non-believer when the Empire took over. So they were kind of an odd pair, but they were incredibly close. They ended up becoming two of the most important members in the history of the Order as they helped resist the Empire on Jeddah, and eventually they joined the Rogue Squadron in their ill-fated mission to steal the plans to the Death Star.
The Holy City, the Kyber Temple, and the last reminder of the Guardians of the Whills were destroyed when agents of the Sith unleashed their superweapons laser on the city.
One last fascinating Force wielder that we have to talk about is the Bendu, which is also perhaps the most confounding entity that we'll discuss today. So the Bendu was this massive Force entity that, at least most recently that we know of, resided on the planet Atollon. Whether he could be elsewhere is still something of a mystery.
He was an ancient being who claimed to represent the centered balance of the Force. He could tap into the Ashla without being benevolent or Bogan without requiring his rage. He was something larger and above the petty slivers of the Force the Jedi and the Sith squabbled over.
When in physical form, he had the appearance of sort of a rocky mammalian that resembled almost a moose, right down to having sort of these giant antler-shaped protrusions. And tapping into the Force, he could control nature, including animals, and he could even manipulate the weather. He also found it easy to tap into and read the emotions of others, and was in tune with the power of foresight, able to predict and see things from the future.
The Bendu was not above his own emotion, though. He could feel anger and frustration, and indeed displayed it when he wanted, and he could vanish at will.
And with the Bendu vanished, that is where our episode vanishes, or at least wraps up. Yeah,
there's not a whole lot known about him. He would display his anger and vanish, or offer some bit of advice. We have some records that a rebel cell had contacted him, and he was sort of pivotal in a battle against the Empire, but where he's been since then, we've seen no indication.
Yeah, all details about him are really sketchy.
Yeah.
It's a little bit frustrating. I really feel like this is one of those things that, like, some anthropologist or archaeologist or historian is going to stumble upon some piece of, like, huge, groundbreaking information about the Bendu at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and I would like to point out also that this is not an exhaustive list of organizations or entities that tapped into the Force. There's many others that we know about, whether that's the Knights of Ren or their Jedi was sort of a center for all sorts of religions that all worshipped the Force, and with the destruction of that city, we don't necessarily know about all of the different sects that were there treating the Holy City as such.
Yeah.
So, a lot more information could come out behind all of this, and maybe we'll end up having to do a part 2. Who knows?
That sounds good to me.
So, as far as mail this week, we've gotten a lot of requests for episodes, but no mail we'd necessarily need to read on the show.
Yeah.
But keep those rolling in if you want to contact us and send us some show ideas or tell us about your connection to some of the events that we've talked about. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to go to fauthentichistory.com and use our contact form, you can get a hold of us as easy as anything. Where can people find you, Holly?
Tootling around the web. I'm on Twitter as Surliest Girl, and I'm on Instagram as SurlyGirly5, and I also host a show called Stuff You Missed in History Class, which can be found at missedinhistory.com, and I host another show with you called Full of Sith.
Yeah, Full of Sith is a lot of fun. So if you like talking about the history of the galaxy and things like that, like we've been doing on this episode, you'd absolutely love Full of Sith. So check it out. If you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter at Swankmatron, and that'll lead you to all of the places where I'm writing. I'll post links to columns on StarWars.com or HowStuffWorks.com or my personal website or about my writing. So that's just the best place to keep up with me. I'm on Facebook too. If you want to look me up at Brian Young, I've got an author page there. If you don't do the Twitter thing, so that's that. If you want to check out Fauthentic History on Twitter, we're at Fauthentics, and you can look us up at Fauthentic History on Facebook. And we would love it if you would offer a review of the show wherever you listen to it, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or wherever else. So, do you have anything else, Holly?
Nope, other than the fact that I want to go learn more about the Force.
Me too. I always love discussions about the Force. But this is a very clinical discussion of it.
Yeah.
But it's nice to have the facts.
Exactly. That gives you a deeper understanding of the mystical and the spiritual parts of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll just we'll leave it there until next time.
Bye.